The air was heavy that night, thick with the kind of tension you don't notice until it's too late. A quiet street in a small suburban town seemed ordinary, dim streetlights flickering, the faint hum of cars in the distance, and the occasional sound of laughter spilling out from a nearby diner. But beneath the surface of this peaceful facade, something sinister was brewing. Her name was Maya. To most people, she was just another passerby, a young woman who looked like she might have been heading home after a long day. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, with her braided hair tied back neatly, Maya blended into the night. But Maya was no ordinary woman. Beneath her calm demeanor and unassuming appearance was a history of discipline, strength, and an unbreakable spirit forged through years of grueling training. Maya was a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite warriors in the world. But tonight, she wasn't thinking about her past or her skills. She was just looking forward to getting home, her mind occupied with thoughts of a phone call she'd had with her mom earlier in the day. As she walked, she noticed a group of men lingering by the corner store. They were loud, their laughter sharp and mocking, cutting through the quiet. Maya felt their eyes on her before she even glanced in their direction. She had learned to trust her instincts, and tonight, they told her something was off. She ignored them at first, her pace steady but purposeful. Years of experience had taught her not to react to provocation. It was often exactly what people like this wanted. But then, it started. "Hey, where you think you're going?" one of them shouted, his voice dripping with hostility. Another chimed in, his words laced with something darker, something cruel. Maya didn't flinch, didn't turn her head. She kept walking, her heart steady, her mind calm. But the men didn't stop. They followed her, their voices growing louder, their insults sharper. To them, she was an easy target, a woman walking alone at night, someone they could intimidate for their own amusement. What they didn't know was that Maya had faced enemies far more dangerous than them. She had stared down threats that would make most people crumble, and she had come out stronger every time. But even with her extensive training and unshakable confidence, Maya knew the importance of restraint. She didn't want trouble. The group closed in, their laughter now echoing in the empty street. One of them stepped in front of her, blocking her path. He was tall, his posture meant to intimidate, but Maya didn't break stride. "Excuse me," she said calmly, her voice steady, but he didn't move. Instead, he smirked, his friends closing in around her. It was in that moment, as their intentions became unmistakably clear, that Maya made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions, but she also wasn't going to let this escalate unnecessarily. She knew she had the ability to protect herself, but she also knew the weight of her actions. Every move she made would carry consequences, not just for her but for them as well. The leader of the group leaned in, his face inches from hers, and sneered, "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Maya didn't respond. Instead, she took a slow, deliberate step back, her eyes scanning her surroundings. Her training kicked in, not in the form of physical action but in the way she assessed the situation, calculated her options, and prepared herself for whatever came next. The tension hung in the air like a coiled spring, ready to snap at any moment. The group of men, emboldened by their numbers and the perceived vulnerability of their target, had no idea who they were dealing with. And then, just as one of them reached out toward her, Maya's calm expression shifted ever so slightly. It wasn't fear they saw in her eyes. It was something else, something they couldn't quite place. A quiet strength, a readiness. What happened next would change everything, but not in the way they expected. Further, Maya stood there, her breathing steady, her heart beating in a rhythm she'd trained to control. The man closest to her smirked again, a cocky sort of grin that suggested he thought this was a game he could easily win. But Maya knew something he didn't. This wasn't a game, and he wasn't in control. The streetlights flickered again, casting shadows that seemed to shift with the tension between them. The group hadn't noticed the subtle way Maya shifted her stance, planting her feet firmly, ready for whatever might come next. The man reached out, his hand stopping inches from her shoulder when something about her unwavering gaze made him hesitate. For a brief second, there was silence, as if the world around them had paused, waiting to see what would happen. The hesitation didn't last long. His friends jeered, pushing him forward, urging him to do something. Maya didn't move, her calm demeanor somehow unnerving. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way the tension was building, and she let it sit there, unbroken. "I'm talking to you," he snapped, his voice sharper now, the bravado faltering just a little. Maya finally spoke, her voice calm but firm. "You don't want to do this." Her words were simple, but the way she said them carried a weight that gave the man pause. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but he quickly masked it with anger. "Oh, yeah?" he spat, stepping closer. "And what are you gonna do about it?" Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. Years of training had taught her that words often only escalated situations like this. Instead, she held his gaze, unflinching, letting the silence speak for itself. The man's friends laughed nervously, trying to fill the growing void, their mockery masking their own unease. What none of them realized was that Maya wasn't just standing there waiting. Her mind was working quickly, analyzing every detail. The positions of the men, the distance between her and the nearest exit, the weight of her backpack on her shoulder, even the sound of footsteps in the distance, faint but growing closer. She remembered her time in training, the endless drills that had pushed her to her limits and beyond. She thought about the moments when she doubted herself, when the odds had seemed insurmountable, and how she'd found strength she didn't even know she had. That strength was with her now, steady and unshakable. But this wasn't a battlefield, and these weren't enemies in the traditional sense. They were just men, ignorant of who they were dealing with, blinded by their own arrogance. Maya didn't want to hurt them. She didn't want this to turn into something it didn't have to be. One of the other men, a shorter guy with a baseball cap pulled low over his face, finally spoke up. "She's not worth it, man," he muttered, his voice low but clear enough to reach everyone. The leader turned on him, his anger now directed at his own friend. "What's the matter with you? You scared of her?" The shorter man shrugged, looking away, but Maya could see it. He wasn't just trying to defuse the situation. He was scared, and not of her. He was scared of what could happen, of where this could lead. The leader turned back to Maya, his jaw tightening. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said, his tone shifting, more aggressive now. Maya tilted her head slightly, her eyes narrowing. She could feel the tension in her shoulders, the way her muscles were coiled, ready to spring into action if she needed to. But she also knew the importance of restraint. This wasn't the time to show them what she was capable of, not yet. "Walk away," she said simply, her voice even. The leader laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You don't tell me what to do," he snapped. Maya didn't respond. She let his words hang in the air, their weight quickly dissipating in the face of her calm silence. It was a strategy she'd used before, in situations far more dangerous than this one. Sometimes, the absence of a reaction was more powerful than any words or actions could be. The group seemed to waver for a moment, unsure of what to do next. The shorter man took another step back, his unease growing. Maya noticed the subtle glances the others exchanged, the way their bravado was starting to crack. And then, the sound of approaching footsteps broke the tension. Everyone turned to see an older man walking toward them, his pace steady but purposeful. He was dressed in a heavy coat, his hands in his pockets, and his face was lined with age and experience. "Is there a problem here?" the man asked, his voice calm but firm. The leader straightened up, his smirk returning as he sized up the newcomer. "Mind your business, old man," he said dismissively. The older man didn't flinch. He looked past the group, his eyes meeting Maya's for a brief moment. There was something in his gaze, a quiet understanding, a recognition of the strength she carried. "Why don't you boys call it a night?" the man said, his tone even but laced with authority. The group hesitated, their earlier confidence now faltering in the face of this unexpected interruption. The leader glanced at his friends, his frustration evident. He wasn't used to being challenged, and he didn't like it. But before he could respond, Maya stepped forward, her movements calm and deliberate. She didn't say a word, didn't make any sudden gestures, but her presence alone was enough to shift the dynamic. She stood there, her eyes steady, her posture relaxed but undeniably strong. The leader stared at her, his bravado now hanging by a thread. For a moment, it seemed like he might push back, might try to reclaim control of the situation. But then, he let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "Let's go," he muttered, turning away. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the quiet street as they disappeared into the night. Maya watched them go, her expression unreadable. She felt the tension in her body begin to ease, but she didn't let her guard down just yet. The older man stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You handled that well," he said simply. Maya nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thanks," she said, her voice soft. The man studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Take care of yourself," he said before turning and walking away, leaving Maya alone once again. She stood there for a moment, the events of the night replaying in her mind. She knew this wasn't over, that the choices she'd made tonight would have consequences. But for now, she was safe, and that was enough. As she resumed her walk, her footsteps steady and her head held high, she couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain: she was ready for whatever came next. Maya walked briskly, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Her mind was calm, but her senses remained sharp, tuned to every sound around her. She replayed the encounter in her head, not out of fear, but to analyze what had just happened. It wasn't the first time she'd been in a tense situation like this, and she doubted it would be the last. What stuck with her wasn't the group's actions but the way the leader had looked at her in those final moments. He had walked away, but not because he wanted to. That hesitation in his eyes told her he wasn't done yet. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and kept moving, her focus shifting back to the route ahead. The air had grown colder, and the street lights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating her face before disappearing into the distance. She could see her apartment building now, just a few blocks away. The thought of home brought her some relief, but there was still a lingering tension she couldn't shake. As she approached her building, she glanced over her shoulder. The street was empty, but her instincts told her she was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, she trusted her gut. She slowed her pace slightly, letting her eyes scan the area without drawing attention to herself. Nothing seemed out of place, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Once inside, she climbed the stairs to her apartment, her steps light and deliberate. The quiet hum of the hallway lights was the only sound as she reached her door and unlocked it. She stepped inside, locking the door behind her before leaning against it for a moment. The familiar scent of her home, a mix of lavender and the faint aroma of coffee, helped ease the tension in her shoulders. Maya set her backpack down and went to the kitchen, filling a glass with water. As she sipped, her thoughts drifted back to the group of men. She couldn't help but wonder what their intentions had been. Was it just idle harassment, or had they been looking for something more? She wasn't one to dwell on negativity, but something about tonight felt unfinished. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. She picked it up to see a message from her close friend, Lila. "Hey, you good? Haven't heard from you all day." Maya smiled faintly and typed back a quick reply. "I'm fine. Just a long day. Let's catch up tomorrow." She set the phone down and walked to the living room, sinking into the couch. The exhaustion of the day was starting to catch up with her, but her mind refused to fully relax. She stared at the ceiling, her breathing steady, as memories of her Navy SEAL training crept into her thoughts. She had been through situations that tested every part of her, mentally, physically, emotionally. The grueling hours, the impossible drills, and the constant pressure to be better than the day before had shaped her into the person she was now. But it wasn't just about the skills she'd gained. It was about the discipline, the ability to remain calm under pressure, and the unyielding belief that she could face anything and survive. Still, Maya wasn't invincible. She knew that. She also knew that the kind of strength she carried often drew attention, both good and bad. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm golden hues across her living room. Maya woke early, her body accustomed to a strict routine. She went for a run, her feet pounding against the pavement as she navigated the familiar streets. The crisp morning air filled her lungs, clearing her mind and sharpening her focus. But as she rounded a corner near the park, she noticed something unusual: a black SUV parked along the curb. It wasn't the car itself that caught her attention, but the way it seemed out of place. The windows were tinted, and the engine was running, though no one appeared to be inside. Maya slowed her pace slightly, her eyes narrowing as she jogged past. She made a mental note of the license plate and kept moving, her instincts once again telling her to stay alert. After her run, she returned home and began her usual routine. But the nagging feeling from earlier lingered, a quiet warning she couldn't ignore. She decided to check in with an old Navy buddy, Marcus, someone she trusted implicitly. Marcus answered her call on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Maya, it's been a minute. What's up?" "Hey, Marcus," she said, her tone casual but laced with an underlying seriousness. I need a second opinion on something. Shoot, he replied, immediately picking up on her mood. She described the events of the previous night and the strange SUV she'd seen that morning. Marcus listened carefully, his tone shifting as she finished. You think they're connected? He asked. I don't know, Maya admitted. But something feels off. Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. Keep your eyes open. If this is more than a coincidence, you'll know soon enough. And if you need backup, you know where to find me. Maya smiled faintly. Thanks, Marcus. I'll keep you posted. After hanging up, Maya sat in silence for a while, her mind turning over the possibilities. She wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but she also wasn't one to ignore her instincts. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maya decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head and figure out her next steps. The streets were busy with people heading home from work, their chatter and laughter filling the air. But Maya's focus was sharp, her eyes scanning her surroundings as she moved through the crowd. She didn't notice him at first, the man standing across the street, watching her from the shadows. He was careful not to draw attention, blending into the flow of people around him. But Maya's instincts kicked in, and she felt the weight of his gaze. She glanced in his direction, her expression neutral, and saw him turn away quickly, disappearing into the crowd. Her heart rate quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. Whoever he wasn't just a bystander. He'd been watching her, and now he was gone. Maya decided to cut her walk short, heading back toward her apartment with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't know what this man wanted or how he was connected to the events of the previous night, but she was determined to find out. As she approached her building, she noticed something out of place. Her apartment door was slightly ajar. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching for just a moment before she regained her composure. She stepped back, her hand instinctively moving to the small pocket knife she carried in her jacket. Taking a deep breath, Maya pushed the door open slowly, her eyes scanning the room for any signs of disturbance. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but as she moved further inside, she saw it, a single piece of paper placed neatly on her kitchen counter. Her stomach tightened as she approached it, her hand steady as she picked it up. The note was short, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. You can't run forever. Maya's grip on the paper tightened as a chill ran down her spine. This wasn't random. Whoever had left this knew who she was and wanted her to know they were watching. She stood there, the note still in her hand, as the pieces began to fall into place. This wasn't just about last night. This was something bigger, something more dangerous. And whatever it was, she wasn't going to back down. Maya's resolve hardened. She had faced worse than this before, and she wasn't about to let fear control her. Whoever was behind this had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated her. Maya stared at the note, her mind racing but her body calm. The words on the paper weren't a threat, they were a challenge. Whoever had left it wanted her to feel cornered, to question her next move. But if they thought they could rattle her, they didn't know who they were dealing with. She folded the note and slipped it into her pocket, her eyes scanning the apartment again. Everything seemed untouched, but she knew better than to assume it was safe. She moved quickly, checking every room with practiced precision. Her training came back to her like muscle memory, every movement calculated and deliberate. She didn't find anyone inside, but the silence felt different now, charged, like the air before a storm. Whoever had been here was gone, but they'd left their presence behind, lingering like a shadow. Maya grabbed her phone and called Marcus. His voice was steady when he answered, but she could hear the slight edge of concern. She told him about the note, the open door, and the feeling that she was being watched. Marcus didn't hesitate. Pack a bag and get out of there, he said firmly. You need to be somewhere secure, at least for the night. I'll come to you. Maya hesitated. Running wasn't in her nature, but she knew Marcus was right. Whoever was behind this had already crossed a line by entering her home. She couldn't risk staying there and giving them another opportunity. I'll text you an address, she said finally. Meet me in an hour. She moved quickly, throwing a few essentials into a bag and double-checking that she wasn't leaving anything important behind. As she zipped the bag shut, her eyes landed on a small framed photo on the shelf, a picture of her and her younger brother, James, taken years ago. She picked it up, her fingers brushing over the glass. James had always been her motivation, the reason she'd pushed herself so hard in the Navy. He was her family, her anchor. Placing the photo in her bag, Maya took one last look around the apartment before slipping out the door. The streets were quiet, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound as she walked to her car. She drove with purpose, her eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, but every time she glanced back, the road behind her was empty. She arrived at the safe house, a small cabin on the outskirts of town that Marcus had set up years ago for situations like this. It was unassuming, tucked away behind a line of trees, and most importantly, off the grid. Maya parked the car and stepped inside, her senses on high alert as she checked the space. It was empty, just as it should be, but the weight of the night's events hung heavy on her. Marcus arrived not long after, his expression serious as he stepped through the door. He carried a duffel bag over his shoulder and set it down on the table. "This is escalating," he said without preamble. "Whoever they are, they're not just messing around. Have you thought about who might be behind this?" Maya shook her head. "No one comes to mind. I haven't been in contact with anyone from my past, and I've kept a low profile since leaving the Navy." "This feels targeted." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "They've done their homework. The note, the timing, it's all deliberate. They want to put you on edge." Maya sat down, her elbows resting on the table as she thought through everything. The men from the alley, the SUV, the break-in, it all felt connected, but she couldn't see the full picture yet. "Let's assume they know who I am," she said. "If they've gone this far, they probably know about my Navy background. But why come after me? What do they want?" Marcus leaned back against the wall, crossing his arms. "Could be personal, could be professional. Either way, we need more information. I'll make some calls, see if I can dig up anything. In the meantime, you stay here and keep your head down." Maya frowned but didn't argue. She trusted Marcus, and she knew he was right. For now, the best thing she could do was wait and prepare. The hours passed slowly, the quiet of the cabin amplifying every small sound. Maya kept herself busy, checking her gear and going over her mental checklist. But no matter how much she tried to focus, the unease in her chest wouldn't go away. She felt like a predator being stalked, watched, but unable to see her hunter. As night fell, the cabin grew darker, the shadows stretching across the walls. Maya sat by the window, her eyes scanning the tree line. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something she couldn't yet see. And then, it happened. A faint rustling sound outside, barely audible but enough to set her on edge. She stood, her movements silent as she reached for her weapon. She didn't turn on the lights, not wanting to give away her position. The sound came again, closer this time. Maya's pulse quickened, but her breathing remained steady. She moved toward the door, her body tense and ready. She could feel the weight of the moment, the way the air seemed to hold its breath alongside her. A shadow moved outside, just beyond the porch. Maya froze, her eyes narrowing as she tried to make out the figure. Whoever it was, they were careful, deliberate, as if they knew exactly what they were doing. Maya's grip on her weapon tightened as the figure stepped closer, their movements slow and calculated. She waited, her heart pounding in her chest as she prepared for whatever was about to happen. And then, the door creaked open. The door creaked open slowly, the sound cutting through the stillness like a knife. Maya didn't move, her body pressed against the wall beside the doorframe. Her grip on her weapon was firm, her mind sharp, every nerve in her body ready to react. The figure stepped inside, their movements cautious, as though they were testing the waters. Moonlight streaming through the window illuminated part of their silhouette. A tall frame, dressed in dark clothing, with a hood pulled low over their face. Maya waited, her breathing steady, her heart pounding in her chest. She needed them to come closer, to give her just one opening. The intruders stopped near the center of the room, their head turning slightly as though scanning for any signs of life. Maya could feel the tension in the air, the split-second decisions that would define the next moments. Just as she was about to step forward, another sound came from outside, a sharp, deliberate knock on the side of the cabin. The intruder froze, their head snapping toward the direction of the noise. Maya's eyes narrowed. Whoever this was, they weren't alone. The knock was a signal, and now she knew there was more than one threat. The figure in the room took a step back, clearly startled by the noise. Maya seized the opportunity, moving swiftly and silently. Before they could react, she had them pinned against the wall, her weapon pressed firmly against their ribs. The hood fell back, revealing the face of a young man, barely out of his 20s, his wide eyes filled with fear and panic. "Who sent you?" Maya hissed, her voice low but commanding. The man stammered, his words tumbling over each other. I don't know," he gasped. "They just told me to come here, to check if someone was inside." Maya tightened her grip. "Who's they? How many of you are out there?" "I swear, I don't know," he pleaded. "I'm just a runner. They pay me to do small jobs, that's it." Before Maya could press him further, the cabin's windows shattered, glass spraying across the floor. Maya dropped to the ground instinctively, pulling the man down with her as a second figure stormed through the now open window. This one was bigger, more prepared, and clearly the one in charge. The new intruder wasted no time, lunging toward Maya with a crowbar in hand. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the swing, and used the momentum to knock over the smaller man, taking him out of the fight for the moment. The larger figure advanced again, their strikes quick and calculated, but Maya was faster. She ducked, countered, and landed a solid kick to their chest, sending them stumbling backward. The scuffle was loud and chaotic, the sound of heavy footsteps and grunts filling the small space. Maya managed to disarm the attacker, but just as she gained the upper hand, she heard the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. She turned her head slowly to see the smaller man, now standing, holding a handgun pointed directly at her. "Don't move," he said, his hands shaking but his intent clear. Maya's mind raced as she calculated her next move. The larger man was down but not out, and the younger one, though inexperienced, was still dangerous with a weapon in hand. The cabin was eerily silent for a moment, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped moving. Maya raised her hands slowly, her eyes never leaving the trembling figure in front of her. "You don't want to do this," she said evenly. "Put the gun down, and we can figure this out." The young man's grip faltered for just a second, but before anything else could happen, a deafening bang echoed through the cabin. Maya flinched, expecting pain, but realized quickly that she wasn't the one hit. The young man dropped the gun, clutching his shoulder as he fell to the ground. Marcus stood in the doorway, his own weapon drawn, his expression grim. "Thought you could use some backup," he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Maya exhaled, relief washing over her for a brief moment. But it didn't last. The larger man had taken the opportunity to recover and was now rushing toward Marcus. Maya acted quickly, intercepting him before he could reach her friend. The two of them collided, their struggle intense and unrelenting. Marcus moved to restrain the younger man, keeping him from retrieving the dropped gun. It took everything Maya had, but she finally managed to subdue the larger intruder, pinning him to the ground with her knee pressed firmly into his back. Marcus tied the younger man's hands with a length of rope he'd brought, his movements efficient and practiced. As the dust settled, Maya and Marcus exchanged a look. "This wasn't random," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "They knew exactly where to find me." Marcus nodded, his expression dark. "And if they sent these two, there's more where they came from." Maya glanced at the two intruders, both of whom were now subdued but still very much a threat. The younger one was pale, his earlier bravado completely gone, while the larger man glared at them with an intensity that sent a chill down her spine. Before they could question either of them, a faint beeping sound caught Maya's attention. It was coming from the larger man's pocket. She reached down carefully, pulling out a small device, a GPS tracker. Her stomach sank as she realized what it meant. "They weren't just here to attack me," she said quietly. "They were tracking me. Whoever's behind this knows exactly where we are." Marcus cursed under his breath. "We need to move. Now." Maya nodded, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The safe house was compromised, and whoever was orchestrating this wasn't going to stop. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was far more dangerous than she had anticipated. The stakes had just been raised, and Maya knew they were running out of time. As she and Marcus prepared to leave, the weight of what was coming pressed heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was bigger, darker, and far more personal than she had realized. Maya and Marcus moved quickly, leaving the safe house behind as the GPS tracker lay smashed on the cabin floor. The two subdued intruders had been tied securely, left behind with just enough to ensure they wouldn't freeze before someone found them. But Maya wasn't naive. Whoever had sent them wouldn't wait long to track their movements. The safe house wasn't safe anymore, and the window of time to figure out the truth was closing fast. As they drove through the dark, winding roads, Marcus kept one eye on the rearview mirror, his tension palpable. "We need answers," he muttered. "If they've been tracking you, they've been watching you for a while. This isn't random." Maya nodded, her mind spinning as she replayed every recent event. The men in the alley, the SUV, the note, the break-in, it all pointed to something carefully planned. But one question still burned in her mind. "Why me?" she said quietly. "What's the endgame?" Marcus glanced at her. "Whoever's behind this knows your past. They wouldn't go to these lengths unless they had something personal or valuable to gain. You said you didn't recognize the guys back there, right?" "No," Maya replied firmly. "They weren't familiar. But their methods." She trailed off, a memory tugging at the edges of her mind. It was faint, buried under layers of other missions and other lives. But there was something about their precision, their signals, and the way they operated that felt too familiar. "I've seen this before," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "Back when I was deployed," Maya continued, her tone sharpening as the memory came into focus. "There was a unit we encountered, mercenaries. They weren't tied to any official government or group, but they had resources, intel, and training. We crossed paths with them during a covert op, and it didn't end well for them. I think they're connected to this." Marcus frowned. "You think someone's holding a grudge? After all this time?" "It's possible," Maya said. "But it doesn't explain why they're after me now. Something else has to be in play." Their conversation was cut short by the sudden glare of headlights appearing behind them, bright and blinding. Marcus cursed, gripping the steering wheel tighter as the vehicle sped up, closing the distance between them. Maya twisted in her seat, her sharp eyes locking onto the SUV barreling toward them. "It's them," she said. "They're not wasting any time." Marcus nodded grimly. "Hold on." He pressed the accelerator, the engine roaring as they raced down the road. The SUV stayed close, its headlights flashing ominously as it tried to force them off course. Maya reached for the weapon stashed under her seat, her instincts kicking in. She rolled down the window slightly, leaning out just enough to get a clear view. The SUV swerved, attempting to clip their rear bumper. Marcus countered with a sharp turn, keeping them steady. "Whatever you're planning, do it fast," he said through gritted teeth. Maya steadied her aim, her breath steady as she fired at one of the SUV's tires. The first shot missed, but the second hit its mark. The sound of rubber shredding filled the air as the SUV veered to the side, its driver struggling to regain control. But instead of falling back, the vehicle rammed forward in a desperate attempt to stop them. Suddenly, the road opened up into an abandoned industrial site, the sprawling lot bathed in dim moonlight. Marcus swerved the car into the open space, slamming on the brakes as Maya jumped out, her weapon drawn. The SUV came to a screeching halt a few yards away, and three figures emerged, their movements swift and deliberate. Maya recognized one of them instantly. The man in the center was older, his face scarred but unmistakable. His name came rushing back to her, Carver. He had been one of the mercenaries from that mission years ago, a shadow in the chaos. She thought he hadn't survived, but here he was, standing in front of her, his eyes burning with cold hatred. "Carver," Maya said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Didn't expect to see you again." Carver smirked, his expression twisted with anger and something else, satisfaction. "You should have left well enough alone," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But then again, you always were too stubborn for your own good." Maya's grip tightened on her weapon. "You've been after me this whole time? For what? Revenge?" Carver shook his head slowly. "This isn't about revenge. It's about justice. You and your team left us to die, and now you're going to answer for it." Maya frowned, confusion flashing across her face. "What are you talking about? You were hired guns, running a black market operation. We stopped you. End of story. Is that what they told you?" Carver spat. "You think you were the hero in that mission? You don't even know the half of it." Before Maya could respond, Carver nodded to his men, who moved to flank her and Marcus. The tension crackled in the air as the standoff escalated. But then, something unexpected happened. A second SUV pulled into the lot, its engine roaring. The doors opened, and several armed figures emerged, their uniforms bearing the emblem of an agency Maya recognized immediately. "Stand down, Carver," a commanding voice called out. The leader of the new arrivals stepped forward, his badge glinting in the moonlight. "This ends here." Carver's smirk faltered, but he didn't lower his weapon. "You think I'm afraid of you? You're just another pawn in their game." The agent ignored him, turning to Maya. "We've been tracking Carver's group for months," he said quickly. "They're part of a larger network. You've been caught in the crossfire because of what you uncovered during that mission years ago." Maya's mind raced as the pieces began to click into place. Carver wasn't just after her for revenge. He was trying to silence her before she could expose something bigger. Something she hadn't even realized she knew. The standoff exploded into chaos as Carver and his men opened fire, refusing to surrender. Maya and Marcus moved in sync, their training taking over as they fought to survive. The agents joined the fray, their numbers turning the tide. The battle was intense, every moment a blur of action and instinct. In the end, Carver was subdued, his men either captured or incapacitated. As the dust settled, Maya stood over him, her breathing heavy. "You underestimated me," she said, her voice cold. "Big mistake." Carver laughed bitterly, even as he was restrained. "You have no idea what you're a part of," he said. "This is far from over." The agents escorted him away, leaving Maya and Marcus to process what had just happened. The truth had been a tangled web all along, and though they had survived the night, Maya knew Carver's words weren't empty. The battle was won, but the war was just beginning. As she and Marcus walked away from the scene, a sense of unease lingered. Somewhere in the shadows, the real enemy was still watching, waiting for their next move. As the sun began to rise, painting the horizon in soft hues of orange and pink, the adrenaline that had carried Maya through the night finally began to wane. The abandoned industrial site was now swarming with agents, securing the area and cataloging evidence. Carver and his men had been loaded into armored vehicles, their defiance replaced with resignation. Despite his threats and cryptic words, Carver was finally in custody, his operation dismantled for good. Maya stood a few feet away from the chaos, leaning against the hood of Marcus's car. Her body was sore, her mind exhausted, but she couldn't stop replaying Carver's final words. "This is far from over." What had he meant? Was there really something bigger at play, or had it been one last attempt to rattle her? Either way, she knew she couldn't let it consume her. She had made it through worse. She always did. Marcus approached, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee he'd snagged from one of the agents. He handed one to her with a small smile, his usual calm demeanor returning now that the immediate danger had passed. "You look like you could use this," he said, taking a sip from his own cup. Maya accepted it gratefully, the warmth spreading through her hands and grounding her. "Thanks," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "What's the verdict? Did they get anything out of Carver yet?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. He's playing the tough guy act, but they'll break him. He knows too much to keep it all locked up." Maya nodded, her mind drifting. She knew that even with Carver behind bars, the questions he'd raised wouldn't disappear overnight. But for now, she had done her part. She had survived, fought back, and ensured that his operation couldn't hurt anyone else. One of the agents who had led the raid approached them, his posture formal but not unfriendly. "Ms. Miller," he said, addressing Maya, "I just wanted to say, what you did here tonight was extraordinary. You saved lives, and you've given us a lead on something much bigger than we anticipated. We owe you." Maya raised an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. "Don't thank me just yet. There's still a lot we don't know." The agent nodded. "True, but every piece of the puzzle helps. And trust me, Carver's capture is a big one. If you ever feel like sharing more about that mission where you first encountered him, we'd be interested." Maya gave a faint smile but didn't respond directly. She wasn't ready to rehash the past in detail, not yet. That chapter of her life had been closed for a reason, and reopening it wasn't something she took lightly. The agent seemed to sense her hesitation and didn't press further. Instead, he extended his hand. "Take care of yourself. And if you need anything, you know how to find us." As he walked away, Marcus leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You think they're really done with you? Or is this just the beginning?" Maya took a long sip of her coffee, letting the question hang in the air. She had learned long ago that nothing ever truly ended, not when it came to the kind of people and organizations she dealt with. But she also knew she couldn't live her life looking over her shoulder forever. "I think," she said finally, "that we take it one step at a time. For now, we regroup, we heal, and we wait." If there's more to this, we'll deal with it when the time comes. Marcus smirked, his respect for her unshakable. Always the calm and collected one, huh? She chuckled softly, shaking her head. Not always. Just learned to fake it well. The two of them stayed there for a while, watching as the scene around them began to wind down. The agents loaded the last of the evidence into their vehicles, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The stillness of the morning felt almost surreal after the chaos of the night, a reminder that life always found a way to keep moving forward. As they finally got back into the car, ready to head home, Maya let out a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her thoughts drifted to the woman in the alleyway, the one she had saved. She wondered if that woman had any idea how much her encounter had set into motion. Maya hoped she was safe, that she had found some sense of peace after her harrowing experience. Driving away from the industrial site, Maya found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The events of the past few days had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, but they had also reminded her of something important. Strength didn't always come from the absence of fear. It came from the ability to act in spite of it, to push forward even when the odds were stacked against you. She glanced over at Marcus, who was humming softly to a song on the radio. His presence had been a grounding force throughout all of this, a reminder that she didn't have to face every battle alone. She smiled faintly, grateful for his unwavering support. By the time they reached her apartment, the city was alive with its usual bustle, the world moving on as though nothing had happened. It was both comforting and disconcerting, the way life continued without pause. Maya stepped out of the car, her body aching but her spirit unbroken. Marcus leaned out the window, giving her a two-finger salute. "Call me if anything comes up. And get some rest, you've earned it." Maya nodded, watching as he drove away. As she walked up to her building, the familiar weight of her keys in her hand, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. She was home. For now, that was enough. Inside, the apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that soothed her nerves. She set her bag down, peeled off her jacket, and headed to the kitchen for another cup of coffee. As she sat by the window, watching the city outside, she let her mind wander. The events of the past few days had left scars, both visible and invisible. But they had also reminded her of her own resilience, her ability to face whatever came her way. She didn't know what the future held, whether Carver's words would come back to haunt her or if this chapter was truly closed. But she did know one thing: she wasn't afraid. As the morning light filled the room, Maya allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. The battles she had fought, both external and internal, had shaped her into the person she was. And no matter what came next, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her through so many storms. For now, though, she would rest. The world could wait.